Welcome, everyone, to Weekend Wisdom by Creating a Family. This is our opportunity to answer your questions. We have two podcasts. We have the long-form one where we interview an expert or someone with a lived experience once a week, and that's usually around an hour. This one is shorter, and this one is directed to your questions. So please send us your questions. Submit them to info@creatingafamily.org. All right, today's question comes from Stephanie. She says, my husband and I are nearing finalization of our 5-month-old adopted son. We don't currently have any other children. Throughout our time in the adoption process, I have spent time learning about adoption trauma and the complexities of adoption. I want to be well informed as our son grows up and aware of the difficulties he may face. However, my question is, are there stories of adoptees, especially males, who have experienced emotional health and emotional success in life? I have heard many stories, both about and from adoptees who have challenges with identity, maladaptive behavior, and experiences with other trauma, which make them at risk for suicide and addiction and depression. Are there any adoptive parents out there who are doing it right, whose adopted kids grow up to be well-adjusted, emotionally healthy adults who can form good relationships? Is our child doomed for a future of emotional trauma and struggle? I would love to hear their stories and learn from them as well. Well, Stephanie, this is a tricky topic to address as an adoption professional and, let's be honest, as an adoptive parent. Many in the adult adoptee community don't want professionals and adoptive parents to speak for them, and they're right, of course. On the other hand, you have asked me, so I'm going to answer, with the caveat that this is a question you should also pose to adult adoptees, and I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. So it seems to me that you're basically asking about the emotional health of adopted people. There are several ways to answer this question. One, through looking at research, and the second is from talking with adopted people. I'm going to start with research because, as you guys probably all know, I love research. So I'm going to start there, but we're not going to end there. All right, so the mental health of adoptees is a hard subject to research. First, adopted people aren't like one big monolithic group. Each is unique, just as with non-adopted people. Also, there are many different types of adoption with different pre-life or pre-adoption life experiences. First, you have infant adoption, and you're comparing that to adopting a 5-year-old from foster care who was neglected or abused versus adopting a 60-year-old from Colombia who spent the last 10 years in an orphanage with no information available in her first 6 years. And you compare that to adopting your 1-year-old grandchild who you've known all of his life. So another difference is adopting a child of a different race from the rest of the family, or adopting just one child versus adopting several kids, or adopting a child who is exposed prenatally to alcohol or drugs, and also adoptees who are raised, say, in an open adoption where all the parents respect each other versus those raised in a closed adoption or an open adoption with fear and animosity. All of these differences could potentially impact the mental health of the adoptee, and most research doesn't separate for these differences. And research is also complicated because it's hard to tease out whether any mental health differences between adoptees and the rest of the population are because of the act of adoption itself or the many other factors that can impact mental health, such as possible genetic predispositions to certain mental illnesses or disorders that they may have inherited from their birth parents, or the adoptive family environment or parenting style, or the child's pre-adoption life experiences, like I mentioned previously about, say even like prenatal exposure to alcohol or drugs. Also, the willingness of adoptive parents to seek and afford counseling. And then we have to throw in poor intrauterine conditions or nutrition or maternal stress during pregnancy, or really, let's be honest, some combination of the above. And another problem with research is that some adopted people feel like research doesn't capture the whole of their personal experience. And people like me who quote research can feel dismissive to them. And I have to acknowledge that is totally fair. But because I am a research geek, I am going to go to the research. So the truth is there are inconsistent findings on the relationship between adoption and mental health. Some studies of adoptees suggest greater self-reported drug use, antisocial behaviors, negative emotions, and other behavioral problems, compared, of course, to the non-adopted population. But other researchers report that adoptees engage in more pro-social behaviors than non-adopted adolescents, such as helping others and things like that. If we look at the meta-analyses, which is always a good way to try to take the 30,000-foot view of things, there's one meta-analysis of 66 studies, and they found that adopted children score higher than non-adopted children on measures of maladjustment, externalized disorders, and academic problems. But another meta-analysis of over 25,000 adoption cases and 80,000 controls, meaning non-adopted children, found only a small difference in behavior problems between adoptees and non-adopted persons. A number of studies have found that adoptees are more likely to be in counseling than non-adopted individuals, and there could be multiple reasons for this. One, adoption brings unique issues and developmental issues across the lifespan, and adoptees encounter different issues from children born and raised by their biological families, and as such, adoptees may need counseling more often than non-adopted people. Two, most adoptive families have had contact with social service agencies in order to adopt, so perhaps there's less stigma about going to counseling and getting social service assistance. For instance, we here at Creating a Family encourage all of our adoptive families to seek professional help if they need it, and certainly do our best to destigmatize getting help. Three, adoptive families as a whole have more money and can better afford to get their child into therapy. And four, and I don't know if this is true, but I've often wondered if it's easier for an adoptive parent to seek counseling for their child because of the general perception that whatever the problem is, I didn't cause it. So there is a fear that I think is not uncommon that therapists are going to blame the parents. And perhaps it's easier if there's another set of parents that you think will get the blame. It is important to note that several studies suggest that adoptees are more likely to attempt or complete suicide. Keep in mind that the actual number of cases is actually quite small, but the difference is statistically significant. So this is an issue that all parents, but especially adoptive parents, need to be aware of. All right, so I'm going to stop now talking about the research. Now let's get to my second suggestion, and that is start talking to adoptees. My first suggestion is to get offline and start talking to adopted folks in your real life. I may be wrong, but from my experience, adoptive parents that worry the most are the ones who are getting most of their information in online groups. And you have to be careful because some groups exist to be a place where adopted people can feel free to express the full breadth of their experiences. And they need this place because our general non-online society overemphasizes the view that adoption is always a blessing to the adopted person and that adoptees should never complain and should feel undying gratitude to their adoptive parents. And you got to admit, this expectation has got to feel wearying. And it overlooks that adoption carries with it some good things and some hard things. And hanging out in these groups is life-affirming for many adoptees and can provide adoptive parents with insight into the full breadth of adoption experiences. However, it can also leave parents feeling like you do. So my suggestion is to ask your question to the adopted people in your real life. And if you think you don't know some, you are wrong. Just ask around. You're going to be surprised at how many adopted people you actually know. And I realize that this next point is going to sound a little hypocritical after what I just said about getting offline. But if you are a member of our Creating a Family Facebook support group, you can post this question there and ask that only adoptees answer. And I think you may be surprised about the breadth of answers you're going to receive. So as to your specific questions, so you ask, are there adoptive parents out there who are doing it right? Absolutely. This doesn't mean that they're doing it perfectly, and it doesn't mean that their kids will never have struggles, but I'm not even sure that that's what we should be seeking for our kids. What we hope is that our kids can experience struggles and bounce back and be resilient and survive. So your second question, are there adopted children who are growing up to be well-adjusted, emotionally healthy adults who can form good relationships? You bet there are. And your last question is our child doomed for a future of emotional trauma and struggles? Well, as a mom of four, I'm going to tell you there aren't any guarantees in this world, but your willingness to be open to learning and changing how you parent to fit your son is going to go a long way to helping assure this outcome. Stephanie, I hope that this has given you some assurance. It sounds like you are on the right track to being a great mom to your boy, and good luck with finalizing your adoption. For everyone else, thank you for tuning in today to Weekend Wisdom. Before you go, let me remind you that we have a newsletter at Creating a Family. It comes once a month. It's free. It comes by email. We curate the best of the information that we've found that month, so we encourage you to sign up. It's creatingafamily.org/newsletter. That's creatingafamily.org/newsletter. Thanks for listening to this week's Weekend Wisdom. If you liked it, please tell a friend to subscribe to the creatingafamily.org podcast. And I will see you next week.